From Yahoo Finance, this is Electionomics. I'm Rick Newman.
And I'm Alexis Christoforous. Today we are talking about what the 4 early Democratic primary elections will tell us, or not tell us, about just where the 2020 campaign is headed. And Rick, let's start with, first of all, we've got the 4 primary elections happening in Iowa, New Hampshire, Nevada, South Carolina.
We're finally getting to some votes. Thank God. It's not all about jabbering in debates with 10 people on a stage.
I know.
I'm sorry, I can't contain my excitement that we're finally going to get some votes.
Things are getting narrowed down. No, I think a lot of people listening to this, including myself, agree with you. Now, there are lots of polls out there. Let's just start with some of the polls in terms of who's leading in which particular state, and are they in agreement?
Right. So when we're talking about the primary elections, it's actually pretty important to look at the polls in the states where the elections are being held rather than the national polls, because they're sometimes quite different. And there are not always a lot of polls especially in the smaller states. Now, Iowa obviously gets a lot of attention. But so here's what we know as we're now pretty close to the voting in Iowa. Bernie Sanders seems to have the lead in Iowa. Whoa, I'm sorry, I knocked over our dolls.
Well, I think all of the candidates were so shocked when you said that.
They all fell over. Even the Bernie Sanders doll fell over when I said Bernie Sanders has the lead. Well, I think Elizabeth Warren really did keel over because she was looking really strong in Iowa last fall.
Right.
And she basically peaked around October or November, and she's been on a downtrend ever since.
And I'm wondering if peaking now is peaking too early. I mean, maybe we don't read too much into the Sanders surge.
I think it's good timing for Bernie Sanders. So I'm looking at the Real Clear Politics aggregation of polling data. And I always like to tell people, anybody can look at this Real Clear Politics polling data. Now shows Bernie Sanders ahead with 25% and that's asking Democrats who would you vote for. So 25% say Bernie Sanders, 22% for Joe Biden, and then Pete Buttigieg, who looked like he might surge for a while, down to 17%, and then Elizabeth Warren, all the way down in a kind of a distant fourth place at 13.5%. So that looks like Bernie Sanders is in a good position, but there's this really important factor that I came across in this is from the American Enterprise Institute, AEI. They have a monthly political report, and they point out that there is yet another poll that asks likely Iowa voters, okay, you think you've made up your mind. If you're pretty sure that you know who you want to vote for, what are the chances that you might still be persuaded to vote for somebody else? 45% say they could still be persuaded to vote for somebody else. Now
was this in which state was this?
This is in Iowa.
Wow,
so now this was in early January, so we're going back a couple of weeks here. But even if that begins to narrow, I think that tells you how much variation and variability there could be.
It's anybody's game still.
It really is.
Yeah.
And
all right, so you gave us
a lot
Iowa.
of it depends on things like, what if it snows? I mean, generally Iowa is a very low turnout primary, and it's not really a primary, it's a caucus, which is different and requires caucus goers to sort of be involved in this process that begins at 7 p.m. It's not the same as you just drop by for 2 minutes.
So weather could be a factor.
Fill out your vote. Weather could be a factor. Mm-hmm. Turnout varies a lot by age, other things that might be going on. And people do ask, like, why is Iowa so important anyway? It doesn't really look like the rest of the United States. It's more rural. It's way more white than the rest of the United States.
Well, it is the first caucus, so
it is the first caucus. It is traditionally the first caucus. Iowa wants it to be that way. I mean, they're the ones who schedule it. And that's why all the energy goes there. But Iowa doesn't always tell us everything. So let's go back to 2016. I'm going to put you on the spot and offer you a quiz. And also for anybody who's watching. So on the Democratic side, do you remember who won the Iowa caucus in 2016?
For which party?
Democrats. So it was Hillary Clinton, Bernie Sanders, and a few others.
Hillary
won by a whisper. Mm-hmm. And then Bernie Sanders won New Hampshire pretty resoundingly. And then we go on to the other races from there. Do you remember who won the Republican primary in Iowa, I should say the Republican caucus in Iowa in 2016. I'll even give you a hint. It was not Donald Trump.
Well, that's what I was going to say.
It was not Donald Trump.
I don't know who.
Ted Cruz.
Oh, my goodness. Okay.
And that was the high point. I mean, I think he
That's
just
what I
kind
mean.
of
You can
he kind of
peak
went downhill
too
from
early
there.
in these primaries.
Yeah. So, it can tell you something. It doesn't tell you. I mean, I've been going back to the history. I mean, I don't have all this in my head for what it's worth. I have to go and research it. But so in 2008, which was obviously a very interesting year where we had the surging Obama, the polls actually showed that Obama had a slight lead in Iowa, and he did end up winning Iowa. But guess who was number 2 in Iowa in 2008 on the Democratic side? And I'll give you a hint here. It was not Hillary Clinton. I mean, it jogs the memories, doesn't it?
It seems like so long ago. Who?
John Edwards came in second in Iowa in 2008.
Now he's just
then he
completely off
just
the
flamed
political
out.
map, right? Yeah.
And then no one, I mean, you really got to be a political junkie to remember who won on the Republican side in Iowa in 2008. I won't even ask you because you'll never guess.
Who?
Mike Huckabee.
Oh, good old Mike.
Mitt Romney was second. Fred Thompson was third.
Wow.
And John McCain, who ended up being the actual nominee in
Right.
2008, was fourth.
So it doesn't tell us a lot. Looking at these things, I guess, singularly doesn't tell us a lot. But tell me what these polls are showing for what are voters thinking in South Carolina? What are voters thinking in Nevada?
Let's do them in order. So Bernie, and so the next one after Iowa is New Hampshire. I think that's 8 days after Iowa. And Bernie Sanders has a solid lead in Iowa. Just about all the polls show him with a lead of 7 to 12%. And remember, Bernie Sanders is from Vermont.
Right.
He's sort of got
That's his region up there.
crusty northern New England vote.
Well, I don't know if we should call them crusty, but okay.
Then when we get to the next one is what's the next one? Next one is Nevada. So I've got them wrong on my computer here. So in Nevada, Joe Biden looks pretty strong. He's up by about 6 points, let's say.
Okay.
Now, anything could change as resources, as the candidates start to pour resources in. And then
South Carolina.
Joe Biden is going to win South Carolina. So South Carolina.
Of those 4 states, though, Rick, does one sort of mirror the larger United States?
Right. So I'll just quiz our audience. So of Iowa, New Hampshire, Nevada, and South Carolina, which looks most similar to the United States racially? Think about it for a second, and I'll jabber here and I'll say, well, Iowa is 91% white. That's voters. New Hampshire, 93% white. So it's not either one of those. Nevada is 59% white, which is almost aligns perfectly with the national average. And then in South Carolina, only 35% of voters are white and 65% are black. Joe Biden does really well with black and minority voters, which is why he's probably going to sweep South Carolina.
So it sounds like Nevada is the winner there in terms of if you want to get a feel for the broader voter sentiment.
Which might most accurately represent the country as a whole. I think Nevada is a good one to watch. I looked at employment numbers by states to try to figure out in terms of the types of industries and workers who are, how are they represented in these states? And just a couple of things stand out. Iowa, obviously a more of a rural state. The data does show Iowa manufacturing is overrepresented in Iowa, and even though we know that Des Moines is kind of a financial center these days, and there's some insurance there as well, professional and business services, that's the category the government follows, underrepresented in Iowa. So Iowa is more manufacturing heavy, and I think that is important to the outcome. And the only other interesting variation, the one outlier with Nevada, is because of Las Vegas. Nevada's way overrepresented on leisure and hospitality jobs. That makes sense. That part of the economy is doing well, though.
Do you think that these Democratic primaries will give us any clues about health care and how the candidates are getting behind this topic?
It's one of the main things I'll be looking for because I think of the I have to shuffle all my papers here to keep my data in front of me, but of the differences between the candidates, to my mind, healthcare, and tell me if you disagree or think otherwise, but healthcare seems to me to be the clearest way to differentiate the candidates. And among Democrats,
I'd say healthcare, education too, but yep, healthcare.
So combine what we think we know about the candidates and how they diverge, and then what issues are most important to Democratic voters. So in Iowa, the issues that Democratic voters care most about, healthcare and climate change tied at 68% saying that's a top issue. The gap between the rich and poor comes next. That's not the economy and jobs, because that's a different category that actually comes lower. The gap between rich and poor, that's basically wealth inequality and income inequality. Interesting to me that people would be that aware of it. Foreign policy actually comes in as the fourth most important issue to Democrats in Iowa, and then the economy comes fifth after those things. So we've talked before on the podcast that the economy is just not important this time around, as important as it has been before.
But maybe that's because it's doing okay.
Could be, yeah.
And unemployment. So it's not in the headlines every day.
Right.
We're not seeing it being bad. It's not gangbusters, but it's certainly not bad.
So when you connect the issues that people care about with the candidates, and then you see that Bernie Sanders is first and Joe Biden is second in Iowa, well, that's a very clear differentiation on health care. I mean, we've talked about this before, but just to remind people, Bernie Sanders, of course, and to a lesser extent, Elizabeth Warren, they both favor Medicare for All, the huge government program that would eliminate private insurance and cost a lot of money. And they say they would pay for it by new wealth taxes and basically get all the funding for that from wealth taxes. And ordinary people, for ordinary people, health care would be free. Many good reasons to be very skeptical that anything like that would ever be free. And there'd be a lot of disruption from that. Joe Biden, of course, says, no, we don't need to eliminate private insurance. If everybody who likes their insurance plan, echo of what President Obama said on Obamacare, if you like your insurance plan, this time we mean it. You really should be allowed to keep it, but he favors a public option for people who cannot get affordable insurance in the private market, but he would leave mostly everything else in place. So that's a real distinction, and that mirrors other distinctions between Biden, who's more to the center, and Bernie Sanders, more to the left. So to some extent, the outcome in Iowa on February 3rd, I get the date right, will be a referendum on health care. What sort of health plan do voters in Iowa really think we ought to have?
We haven't discussed him, but Mike Bloomberg has he hasn't said it himself, but one of the people as part of his campaign, Brad Tusk, was on one of our shows.
Yeah, I watched that. That was a good interview you had with him.
Thanks. And he was actually with Mike Bloomberg during his third term as mayor, when he was running for that third term as mayor of the city of New York. And he said that to Mike's mind, if Biden were to win Iowa, Mike would step back and probably not continue to run. But anybody other than Biden— Did
he say that outright or just sort of hint at it?
I felt like he said it outright. I mean, we'd have to go back and listen. But that, if anybody other than Biden were to take Iowa, Mike would remain in the race.
Press forward in the Democratic race.
Yeah.
So let's try to think this through. If Biden wins Iowa, it also depends by how much he wins Iowa.
So
if he wins convincingly,
and
this Sanders surge that the polls seem to be showing turns out to be kind of a phantom surge, somebody like Bloomberg might be able to safely conclude Biden's got this. Because if he can win by this much in Iowa, he can win in all the other states that matter. By the way,
if it's a slim margin,
if it's very close, I mean, it is. It's likely that Sanders is going to win New Hampshire, and then then you have to think about Nevada. So let's say it's a split decision,
which happens February 22nd, by the way.
That's a number 3 primary. So let's say it's a split decision. Biden narrowly wins Iowa. Sanders wins New Hampshire as expected. Then Nevada becomes really important. And again, once again, Nevada looks a little bit more like the rest of the country than these two very white states.
Even if Biden were to take Iowa, 45% of the voters, according to the latest poll there, said they could be swayed to another candidate. If I'm Mike Bloomberg and I hear that, I'm thinking maybe I stay in this race.
Yeah. Bloomberg, my understanding of Bloomberg, and by the way, I was surprised that Brad Tusk, as you were.
That he said that.
He was
that he even
much
let that
more
out.
forthright than sort of politicians or their spokespeople really ever are, which I thought was refreshing.
It was refreshing. Being on the other side of the table, I thought that was refreshing.
While you were hobnobbing with the 0.01% in Davos, Jen Rogers capably filled your shoes, and we did talk about Mike Bloomberg and what his plan seems to be and where he seems to be heading. He's actually really making interesting traction. So he has gone from almost nothing in the polls, at the time he announced, to around, now this is at the national level again, to around 10%. And in some polls, he's higher than Buttigieg at the national level. He's not campaigning in these early primary states, so he's really not part of this discussion we're having.
And he hasn't been part of a debate
And he
It's
hasn't
all
been part of a
commercials.
debate,
His ads are
and he
running all
won't
the
be
time.
because he's not taking any funding,
Right.
so he's never going to qualify by that measure, which means he'll never get into a televised debate. So where's he going with all this? I mean, the idea seems to be that he's the backup. He considers himself the backup plan for the Democrats if they seem to be on their way to nominating Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren.
Well,
what happens if it is Biden? The most interesting thing Bloomberg has said, to my mind, is even if he ends up not being the candidate or even in the race, he's still going to spend a shit ton of money to get a Democrat elected.
Right. Well, yeah.
And then
he
let's
can throw
talk
his
about that
power
money.
behind.
Talk about how much money the amount of money we're talking about here. He said $1 billion, and then later reports are up to $2 billion.
And about causes, he'll throw it behind causes he cares about, right? Gun violence, climate change. That's what, and he'll go with the candidate who backs what he believes in.
$1 billion. We talk about dollar figures. At the government level, $1 billion is kind of nothing. But for all the money in politics, $1 billion is a ton of money.
Of course.
It's more than every donor from every source spent to get Hillary Clinton elected in 2016. So that was like $650 million. And one guy is saying, I'm going to spend even more than that.
Even if I don't get the nomination.
Even if I don't get the
Right.
nomination.
Well,
so that is a transformative amount of money.
The majority of CEOs I spoke with
in Davos
for the World Economic Forum felt that the only formidable opponent to Trump would be Mike Bloomberg.
What do they think about Biden?
They were lukewarm. In fact, he really wasn't much part of the conversation. They definitely made clear that they felt if Sanders were to win the nomination, we would see, and they use these words, the stock market would crash. It would be horrible for the economy. I mean, no surprise given the folks that I was talking to.
And these are American CEOs?
American CEOs.
Can you name any of them? Or were these like off-the-record discussions?
No. They're all there with all of our interviews that we did at the World Economic Forum. Andy Sorwer and I hosted 2 hours of live programming every day. So we had CEOs, everybody from the CEO of Marriott, Tyson Foods, Cisco. And when we asked each of them, and in fact, many of them had a breakfast with President Trump one of the mornings they were there. Mm-hmm. And their takeaway was, say what you will about President Trump, but we think he's going to get reelected because the status quo is okay. We keep saying this time and time again. Stock market looks good. They rattled off all the reasons why. Unemployment at a 50-year low. And when we asked them about the Democrats, when we pushed them about who would actually be a real opponent to him, they said it would be Bloomberg. So many of them also, might I say, have working relationships with Michael Bloomberg over the years as CEOs.
Yeah. That's interesting. Plus, what CEOs probably are not real eager to say publicly is they are gaga about the Trump tax cuts. I mean, they got a bigger tax cut under Trump than they ever could have wished for. And they're even
that's
Biden.
Faded now. That's
even
faded.
Biden has said, well, it's fading, but I mean, the lower tax rate remains in effect. And look what they've been able to do. I mean, we know where most of the savings from the tax cut have been spent, not on business investment or business spending. Most of it has gone to dividend increases and buybacks, which CEOs love because that makes their shareholders happy. So shareholders love them. I mean, life is great in corporate America. I think CEOs seem surprisingly dumb to me about politics sometimes. And everybody has dismissed Joe Biden. And I wonder why. Everybody assumes he's going to flame out or, by the way, I should make some use of these dolls. There's Joe. I mean, look at how trim and experienced he is. I mean, he's very reassuring with his finger.
He does look very
Bernie
fit
Sanders
there.
inspires panic. That's why this doll looks panicky. I'm not even going to raise the Elizabeth Warren doll.
She doesn't deserve to be raised now. Uh-oh.
Everybody has been dismissing Joe Biden, and I don't know why they cannot see the polls that say he is still the front runner. He's basically been the front runner the whole time. Mm-hmm. And his lead has varied. So he's been up around 35% might have been the peak, and then he comes down to 28%. But he has always been in front of Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders. And it's true that Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders are probably, so they're both going for the same set of voters. So if you put them together, that looks like a number that is higher than Joe Biden's number. But Biden is also fighting with Pete Buttigieg and Amy Klobuchar. Don't forget about her. And there are a few others, Andrew Yang. So Klobuchar is more of a centrist. So if she bails out, Biden would theoretically get her voters.
Would Biden theoretically ask her to be on his ticket as VP?
Let me just say one more thing about Buttigieg. And I think, it's one of the things that is going to happen probably after these 4 contests is this field is going to get a lot narrower. And people may not know this, but there are still around 12 major Democrats running for president. And we're probably going to get down to 4 or 5 at the most by the end of February. And then comes Super Tuesday in March, and that will be definitive. So we could
we'll know who the Democrat, pretty much who the Democratic
to 4,
nominee
and then
is.
by 3 at that point.
Right.
So if the polls hold as they are, the final 4 will be Biden, Sanders, Warren, and Buttigieg. Amy Klobuchar does have a meaningful amount of support in the Midwest. So I would guess that she would throw that to Biden as a kind of a traditionalist. But you want to talk about the vice presidential sweepstakes. I think Biden has to have a black candidate as vice president. I think that he just must. So if you buy that, it could be Cory Booker, and it could be Kamala Harris, and it could be somebody else we're not thinking of. But either one of them, I think, would be kind of a likely.
I think Kamala would be too fiery for Joe.
Well,
I can see a Cory Booker Biden ticket.
Kamala Harris is. So they had the one big moment of the Kamala Harris campaign was when she went after Joe Biden on busing.
Right, racism and busing.
And,
I do remember that.
You really had to be paying attention early on to even notice that. And when that happened, I think a lot of people were like, what is she talking about? White voters, anyway. Why is busing an issue somewhere? It's really not.
She went back to when she was a little girl
decades,
and had to.
And I sort of thought that seemed to me like a weird thing for her to be sort of staking her candidacy on. And I just don't think she got any traction with that. But I think that Joe Biden and Barack Obama actually were at each other's throats more than this in 2008. And they patched it up. And God, Donald Trump has patched it up with people who used to be the worst critic, his absolute worst critics. The man is unfit for office. Mike Pompeo said things to that effect. He's now Secretary of State. I think it'd be very easy for Biden and Kamala Harris to patch it up and find a way to work together. She's not. Her positions are not as clear cut as Elizabeth Warren's, so she's more fungible to my mind. Mm-hmm. And I think she could fit right into a Biden administration. And then you can also ask. Who would, if a Biden presidency, who would be his cabinet members? And that would be the opportunity to really put some great women and minorities into cabinet level positions. So to my mind, Amy Klobuchar and Kamala Harris, both highly qualified to be attorney general.
Yep,
but, when you're running for president, you don't say, well, you have to say who your vice presidential pick is, but you don't say, here's some of my attorney general nominations. That's getting way ahead of yourself. I guess you can hint at it. So,
but don't think you're going to see Mike Bloomberg pop in as VP. Even Brad Tusk said he's not interested in that.
There's no chance. Yeah.
He would want to be top dog or no dog at all. Although maybe he might take a cabinet position. You never know. Well, if it was the right cause.
Bloomberg, let's say Bloomberg really is a kingmaker and he puts a ton of money behind a Biden candidacy, Treasury Secretary.
Sure.
Or Secretary of State. I think he'd be qualified for either.
Will impeachment be part of this, do you think, for the voters? Because we know that the Democrats made sure the trial got underway before anybody walked into that first caucus.
Yes. So to just narrow this down, so I think what we will learn from the 4 early primaries is where voters headed on health care. National program or stick with private insurance and enhance it a little bit. I'm very interested in how the vote turns out by income level. So are working class voters going more for Bernie Sanders, blow everything up and start over, or Joe Biden, let's get back to basics? And are the polls anywhere, are the polls at all accurate? It's a legitimate question after 2016. What we will not learn, four primaries are not going to tell us who the ultimate nominee is going to be.
We still have to
We'll
wait.
get some hints. But I will be very surprised if there's a clear front runner after the first 4 primaries, unless it's Biden. I'd be least surprised by that. On my list of what we're not going to learn Is the economy helping Trump or not? That's going to be
too early
a huge
to tell.
question as we get to, it depends what the economy's like in October.
True.
And then what you just raised, is impeachment really going to hurt Donald Trump? As we sit here, it appears John Bolton may end up having his say before the Senate votes. We talked earlier, or maybe last year, about some possible wild cards in the election. Remember, we said what John Bolton has to say, whether it's in testimony or in his book or both, we're probably going to know in 2020, and that is one of the wild cards hanging out there.
Of course, the former national security advisor. Yeah, right. So we're going to learn a lot more in the coming weeks. You and I will be here with some guests as well.
Finally, some voting.
Breaking it down and moving towards clarity. All right, I want to thank everybody for listening to this Electionomics podcast. Be sure to catch us next time and follow me at Alexis TV News.
And me at Rick J. Newman.